Hello, beautiful people, and welcome, to a video on the best team for each cryo carry, aka Escoffier propaganda. First, let's start with Ganyu. And Ganyu is the cryo character that is the most interesting team building wise, because she has a lot of different parts of her kit that try to pull her in different directions. On one hand, she has her target attacks that are fairly powerful, and on the other, she has that burst, as well as a little bit of self-buffing, but also some team buffing in her ascension passives. Ganyu's numbers when she came out were balanced in a way that ideally, since her charge attack doesn't have ICD, you want to react as many charge attack hits as possible. But if you use your burst, that increases the speed of your cryo application, which can make you lose some melts. Does that mean it's not worth using burst? No, burst is still worth using in pretty much every team for Ganyu. But it does mean that the burst is a bit less important, and you can still get good results even without the burst, because despite the burst being powerful, and despite the burst being worth using and increasing your damage, it is also going to potentially steal some of your melts. So yes, you're gaining DPS from using the burst, but you're also losing DPS from whatever melts you end up not getting because of the burst. You still gain more than you lose, but it does mean that effectively, instead of having access to 100% of her kit in melt teams, you only have access to like 70 to 80% of her kit. And that makes it so that despite melt being very synergistic with Ganyu, right, since she doesn't have ICD on charge attack, she basically ends up doing more overall outside of melt teams, which bridges the gap and makes it so that those teams that have worse synergy, that don't have that melt, have Ganyu more effectively use a larger portion of her kit. That's a lot of words and a lot of yapping, but the main conclusion to take away from that is that Ganyu's kit is designed for her to be viable in multiple different archetypes. Nowadays, the best Ganyu team is with Escoffier, because every cryo character's best team is with Escoffier, but she's actually one of the few characters where the non-Escoffier alternatives are not that far behind. And if you have a really, really high investment on your characters, if you have also potentially Constellations on Ganyu, Signature on Ganyu, because the Escoffier teams have their damage, the damage is very split, whereas the Melt teams are more focused around buffing Ganyu's output instead of having everyone contributing. It creates a situation where if you have really high investment Ganyu, you can actually end up dealing more damage in your Ganyu Melt teams than in the Escoffier teams. Unfortunately, that's not because the Melt teams are great, that's because even Escoffier isn't enough to make Ganyu a particularly powerful carry nowadays. I don't want anyone to start relying on GC Sim DPS numbers too much, because very often it's important to understand the context around them. But for the sake of this video, I think it's gonna help drive the point home very well. So I'll be looking the GC Sim database for a lot of these characters, just to show what happens, basically. So these, like, non-C6 bullshit teams, the Escoffier teams, it's the good ones, right? The ones with Shenhe here. They are slightly north of 80k DPS at KKM standard. The best melt team on GC Sim is at 75k, which is honestly not that far behind, right? When you open both of them, you see Ganyu here is at 63% of the team DPS, but here only at 43. So if you have hyper investment on Ganyu, this team can actually pull ahead. But post Natlan, 80k DPS, it's not too impressive. 80k DPS will be enough for Abyss, but 80k DPS is actually around what you need for Stygian Onslaught when the boss is the right one for you. In other words, a team like this against Cryo Automaton is only going to be able to clear with high investment and great gameplay. I've actually seen a lot of people say that, you know, they have Escoffier, they have Farina, and their Ganyu team still isn't able to clear. Whether it's because they're not playing it perfectly enough, or because their artifacts are average, not amazing. But 80k is pretty tight in content that is designed for these archetypes, for Fearless Stygian Onslaught. And so, it's generally not the sort of stuff I'd recommend, right? Ganyu's not a character that is great nowadays. But this video isn't about evaluating each character and their place in the meta, right? It's about talking about their best teams. I think it's important to understand the context of the meta, because if a character is so weak that they can't clear even in the best case scenario, then their best team is going to be Bennett, Mawiga, Citlali, so you can actually clear with them on the team. And what I'm trying to get at here is just Ganyu's on the ledge. Anyways, when it comes to her best teams, right? We've already said the Escoffier freeze teams, and we've already mentioned burning. But what are the burning teams that are good? Because Ganyu's burst can yoink your melts, you have basically 3 options. Option 1, accept that you're gonna lose a decent amount of melts, and just be okay with that. Because when you're not melting your Ganyu charge attack, you're applying Cryo, so your next Pyro hit at least is gonna melt. Probably won't be as much damage as if you melted Ganyu, but it's not gonna be the end of the world. Option number 2, increase your Pyro application. Bring more Pyro units, or use like a Pyro-infused Kazuha burst or something like that. Option number 3, increase the strength of your Pyro aura. Make it so that your individual Pyro applications allow you to react more hits. You can do that either by using Sunfire. When you trigger Swirl on yourself with Gene Burst plus Bennett Burst at the same time, it applies 2U Pyro to nearby enemies, not 1U. But that forces you to use Gene, which is not an amazing unit. Or use Burning. Burning is also a way you can strengthen the strength of your aura. That's why on GC Sim, the highest simmed Ganyu team is with Burning. Burning also allows you to run slightly slower Pyro application, which lets you run Maoika and Cinder City instead of Xiaoling, who generally is going to have very high ER requirements in the Ganyu teams, so her DPS isn't going to be that high, and she's not buffing like Maoika fan. Oh yeah, I guess that's the 4th option. It's just don't use Burst. And because Maoika's Burst is so good, the damage you get from melting Maoika's Burst is kind of enough to make Maoika better than a Pyro character that allows you to use Ganyu's Burst. Anyways, when you start excluding Escoffier, you start falling to around 65k here. And the reality is that a team like this is probably not clearing Stygian Onslaught difficulty content. But it's still fine generally for Abyss at the very least. Freeze teams without Escoffier have about 3/4 of the damage of freeze teams with Escoffier. So if you want to play Ganyu as a carry in a freeze team, Escoffier makes a massive difference, right? You're gonna want to use Ganyu, Escoffier, Farina, and then +1 with that +1. Having a little bit more flexibility. Generally, Shenhe is the best. It's generally slightly better than her best melt teams, but not that much better. And freeze teams without Escoffier are generally worse than the melt teams you can do otherwise. Next. I don't want to make a video dedicated to physical carries because we only have 1. Technically, we have 3, right? There was Razor. His best teams aren't physical carry teams. Now you have Eula and Fremine. Both of them are Cryo, so I'll just talk about them in this video. Eula's numbers are not good. The unfortunate reality is that Eula is a character who, on a release, was pretty underwhelming. And we've had a lot of power creeps since her release. Nowadays, she's honestly one of the worst units in the game. She has multiple different team archetypes that are stronger than the one that uses her intended kit. Eula's best team right now is arguably Pyro Plunge with Bennett, Shenhe, and Citlali. And assuming everything goes right, it actually is a pretty good team. Eula is a Claymore character, which means that she inherently has higher plunge motion value. She's on the high side for Claymore characters for plunge motion value. She has a crit ascension. She's a Cryo character, which gives you Cryo resonance in that plunge team. She has a bit of Cryo application, which can allow you to react 1 or 2 additional plunges on top of what you can from Citlali. By default, you can jump and plunge up to 8 times with Shenhe, but if you do that, if you jump and plunge 8 times, that's too much Pyro application for Citlali to keep up. And so having a little bit more Cryo application from Eula can actually allow you to plunge more. But that's mechanically fairly difficult, and you don't have that much wiggle room on the execution. Anyways, assuming everything goes right, and you do 8 plunges, which is technically possible, though difficult, Pyro Plunge Eula is actually good. It calcs higher than every other Cryo carry except Skirk, basically. Like, it's even higher than Ayaka with Escoffier. The thing is, that is not happening. Not only is there, like, an incredibly low tolerance for error in the team, but there's also a lot of potential practical issues because of how burst reliant the team is and how little energy it generates. On top of that, Eula is completely unnecessary to the team. There's so many characters that can take her place in the team and be like within 10% of the team DPS. And people that pull for her are often not going to want to just ignore everything her kit does and just be playing a driver for Shenhe and Plunge. It probably won't feel like you're playing Eula, it'll feel like you're just playing Plunge. And so despite the team having a situation where it's fairly good, I would generally not recommend it for most people. But if you're looking at GC Sim stuff, it actually is the highest simming T0 or 0 Eula team. Even higher than Bennett Maoika Citlali, which is the second highest one. This, obviously, though, is not an Eula carry team. This is a team where you're using Eula on a support set, on a support weapon, and you're just pressing her skill so that you get the support set proc, and that's it, right? So this, to me, does not count as a team we need to talk about here. After her best team being the Pyro Plunge, her next best team is with Escoffier. Just using a freeze team where you're pretending like Eula's on the team, putting her on field, but getting hard carried by Escoffier, Farina, Yulon's off-field damage is gonna be the next best way to play her. But again, it won't really feel like an Eula team. So I think a lot of people that like her won't really want to play these teams. That being said, at the very least, unlike the Pyro team, it does use her kit. You do play Eula, like, mechanically the same way you would play her in her physical teams. She's still a physical carry in those teams. It's just that the damage is not very impressive from herself. You're getting wheelchaired, basically. Escoffier is not the only wheelchair option you have. You can also do, like, Shilonen, Yulon, Farina, but it's not quite as good as Escoffier is. Escoffier wheelchair, assuming that your cryo is, or your carry is cryo or hydro, is generally just better than Shilonen wheelchair. And finally, you get into the quote-unquote proper Eula teams, right? The ones where maybe you're using an Electro unit with Superconduct, you're using Bennett for the buff. Those teams are a lot worse. They're still at a level of DPS that can clear Abyss, but they're just not at a level of DPS where they can clear Siege and Onslaught. Maybe if you have like C2 Farina, I don't know, C3 R1 Eula, you can like just barely do it when the boss is favorable for physical, but it'll be a lot harder than if you just slap Escoffier on the team. If what you're looking at though is a team where it feels like you're playing her as a physical carry, I can completely understand not wanting to use her with Escoffier. And so generally, well, you can still use her in Escoffier even in a team that doesn't have Escoffier's passive maxed out, right? Escoffier is still an off-field damage dealer that generates energy to battery Eula, and that heals if you need Farina. And she's still generally better than most other alternatives, even if your last slot is not Cryo or Hydro. And then finally, that last slot, right, you can use an Electro unit. There's also other healers you can use instead of Escoffier. Shenhe is actually quite good in Eula teams, even outside of the Pyro Plunge teams, because as it turns out, the numbers on Eula's burst are really bad, to the point where focusing on physical plunge gameplay, despite the fact that physical plunge as a concept is just kind of oxymoronic. Like it doesn't make any sense for your characters focused on physical to want to build for plunge damage. You don't have any synergy between physical and plunge. But because Eula's burst numbers are so bad, it's actually generally better in the physical teams to use Xianyun and plunge over a character that buffs physical damage and focus on burst gameplay. Part of that is because of Eula's quite high energy requirements. Her high ER requirements mean that you have to both bring characters that give you a lot of energy and build a decent amount of ER on her if you want to burst every rotation. But going for a plunge focused playstyle lets you still have quite decent damage even when you don't have burst, so you don't need to burst every rotation anymore. Before they released Escoffier, the highest simmed physical team for Eula on GC Sim was a Xianyun team where you bursted every 3 rotations, because it was just better to not build any ER and not bring cryo batteries and just burst whenever you have it than it is to focus on the burst. That can change with higher constellations, but her constellations are not as good as people think. Like C6R5 Eula with C6R5 supports is just barely ahead of Pyro Plunge at C0R0. Now obviously, if the C6R5 supports you're bringing are Escoffier and Farina, it'll be significantly ahead. Like if they released a character that had numbers as good as C6R5 Eula nowadays at C0R0, they'd be a balanced character that isn't that appealing to get. They'd be, in my eyes, about as appealing to get as a character like Kinich. Anyways, if you want to play physical Eula despite all of that because you really like her, I'd ask myself, do I care a lot about the burst? If not, I would 100% recommend going for Xianyun teams if you want to play physical. Otherwise, if you really care about using the burst, I would generally lean towards the Escoffier teams, right? You get to play Eula in her intended gameplay with the intended damage profile, but you don't get completely punished by how bad her numbers are because Escoffier is carrying in the background. But if you really want her to be the main source of damage on the team and in a physical team, you're not going to have a good time. You're actually going to struggle to clear Abyss content, let alone Siege and Onslaught. From an A, basically the same. Honestly, like, it's actually hilarious how close they are to one another. healer. The like min-max optimized GC Sim rotation for Eula Pyro Plunge, 105k. The one for Fremine Pyro Plunge, 107k. Basically the same number. The Escoffier optimized sim for Femine, 76.5k. For Eula, 75k. Right, again, basically the same number. They're basically the same character. Though that is assuming C6 Femine. C0 Femine is going to be somewhere between 10 and 20% behind, depending on the team. Next is Ayaka. Ayaka got a pretty big buff from Escoffier. The Ayaka teams previously were the ones that struggled the most in terms of lack of fully inherently synergistic teams. Ayaka had access to a lot of units that synergized with her, but a lot of them didn't synergize with one another or weren't that good. Mainly, it was difficult to get a healer and Farina on the team without having one of your units be kind of eh. Pre-Shilonen, right, pre-Natlan, you'd have to either use a Cryo healer and not use Shenhe, which has great synergy with Ayaka, or an Animo healer and not use a grouper. Then Shilonen came out and you could use Shilonen instead of your Animo, but you're still not using a grouper, which is kind of annoying. And at the time, Ayaka's team DPS was at a level where if it was single target boss content, she was kind of struggling to clear it in time. Like, she was able to, but it was a lot worse than the other characters. And so not having a grouper made it so that she also struggled in AoE content, which made it feel like she didn't really work well anywhere. The release of Escoffier changed that. Not only did it make the teams like more synergistic, but it actually significantly increased the team DPS to the point where it actually feels like Ayaka is strong enough to use even in single target content. Out of the pre-Skirk cryo carries in teams where they're actually being used in their intended way, so no pyro plunge bullshit, Ayaka is the strongest one, and by a decent amount. Her best team is Ayaka, Escoffier, Farina +1. The best +1 is Shenhe, but Yelan is actually not that far behind. But honestly, Escoffier was a blessing for Ayaka players because pre-Escoffier, Ayaka's best teams with Ayaka as a carry weren't really better than Ayaka Hyperbloom, right? They were very, very similar in output. And when a carry's best team, like as a carry, like properly as a carry, is clearing as fast as if you're using them with Nahida, Raida, and Singtao, it doesn't feel good to play them. Escoffier's release made it so that the freeze teams with Ayaka carry actually do feel noticeably better than the Hyperbloom teams. If you don't have Escoffier, you can still play the Hyperbloom teams, but those teams, and just like the non-Escoffier freeze teams, they're at the level where they can clear Abyss with enough investment, but it's actually low enough DPS that if you get half countered, right, if you're against an enemy with reasonably high cryo resistance, you might not clear in time, even if you don't get hard countered. All in all, unfortunately, use Escoffier or suffer. Next is Wriothesley. Wriothesley is like Ganyu in that his Escoffier teams aren't that much better than his non-Escoffier teams. But also, like Ganyu, his Escoffier teams are a decent amount worse than the Ayaka Escoffier teams. To the point where, instead of having an on-fielder like Wriothesley, using a random-ass 4-star support like Rosaria is about the same DPS. I saw a really funny sim earlier where Crescent Pike Hybrid Rosaria is like 3% less team DPS than Wriothesley in an Escoffier core, because the crit rate buff that Rosaria gives to the rest of the team is enough to make up for most of the damage lost from Rosaria's damage being lower than Wriothesley's. Wriothesley, like Ganyu, is a character that can be played in melt teams. He melts a lower portion of his damage than Ganyu does, right? Ganyu can melt every single charge attack hit, and I mean, I suppose so can Wriothesley, but Wriothesley also has normal attack damage, and that normal attack damage is not all reactable. In Wriothesley's combos, you generally do either in 3C or in 5C, which lets you react a little bit over half of your damage, free reaction multiplier. But his relatively slower application compared to Ganyu means that he can get away with slower pyro applicators without relying on burning. Because of that, Wriothesley's best melt team, I'm pretty sure, is Chilonen Mawika. Overall, Wriothesley's freeze teams with Escoffier are just like Ganyu, slightly ahead of his melt teams. And then you have his melt teams, you have his Hyperbloom teams that are fairly similar to the melt teams, actually concerned with investment, but a high investment, the melt teams will be better. And then below that, you have the freeze teams without Escoffier. And finally, we have Skirk. Skirk is the best cryo carry by far. It's not even remotely close. Skirk is only playable in freeze teams, but Skirk's freeze teams without Escoffier are better than every other cryo carry's teams, except Ayaka with in premium with Escoffier. But like, Skirk with all 4 stars is gonna have better teams than Wriothesley's premium teams, than Ganyu's premium teams. Skirk's numbers are just very inflated. They're post-Natlan numbers. She's balanced in a way that in her premium team with Escoffier, Farina +1, she is somewhere between 5 and 20% behind Maoika, depending on Maoika's teams and Skirk's teams. But that doesn't mean that there are situations where she's only around 5% behind in DPS, which is really close. There is no other carry that gets as close to Maoika as Skirk does. But on top of that, Skirk is fairly easy to play, and unlike Maoika, she's not reliant on specific timings. Like, she does have cancels, but if you don't do them, it's fine. Whereas with Maoika, if you fuck up your timing, you can end up not melting your burst, which makes her a lot worse. I'm not trying to make the argument that Skirk is a better carry than Maoika, but I am trying to make the argument that she's not that much worse. And I would argue, if you have the tools to make Skirk's best team, and you don't have the tools to make Maoika's best team, you actually can end up giving you a better team on your account. Skirk's passives basically makes it so that she's completely awful outside of freeze teams. Like, technically, if you play Skirk Hyperbloom, it's pretty similar to Wriothesley Hyperbloom. If you play Skirk Melt, it's not that much worse than Ganyu Melt. But why would you do that when freeze is so much better? It's not just that freeze is better, it's that playing a unit that is not Cryo or Hydro in her teams is actually griefing. The best non-Cryo or Hydro unit is generally gonna be worse than the worst Cryo unit. You're better off putting a level 1 Aloe you don't swap into on your team than Shiloden, than Bennett, than any of those. Do not ever make a Skirk team with a character that is not Cryo or Hydro. As for which Cryo and Hydro units, obviously you have Escoffier and Farina, which are like the main two. If you don't have Escoffier, Farina is not that important anymore because your healer options outside of Escoffier are a lot worse. If you don't have Farina, Escoffier is still very much worth using. If you have Farina but no Escoffier, you'll generally want to use either Mika or Eula. Depending on what your last slot is, I think either of them can end up being better. Depends on the situation. I would generally lean a little bit more towards Mika, but I think it's pretty close. If you have Escoffier but no Farina, I think a lot of people often forget Skirk is reliant on you generating Void Rift. You need to have some off-field Hydro. You're pretty much going to need either Xingqiu or Yulan. Yulan will generally be a little bit better, but if you don't have her, it's not the end of the world. You can do a 4-star only team with Skirk that is still pretty much in between Wriothesley Premium and Ayaka Premium. There's not that much difference between a lot of the 4-star units you can use. You can use Xingqiu, you can use Rosaria, you can use Charlotte, you can use Mika, you can use Dahlia, you can use Kaya. You've got options. If you're not someone who gets attached to specific characters and you just pull mainly for meta reasons, and you're wondering, like, I have a full Wriothesley team except Escoffier. Should I go for Escoffier or Skirk? I think you'll end up with a team that is pretty similar in overall performance either way, whether you do a Skirk team without your Escoffier or a Wriothesley team with Escoffier. In the pre-release stuff, I was a bit more negative on Skirk. Not that I was overall negative, but I emphasized the reliance on Escoffier more because at the time she was weaker. They nerfed her between beta and live, or sorry, they buffed her between beta and live. And with those buffs, I'd say that she has reached the point where her and Escoffier are fairly similar upgrades to your freeze team on your account if you already have a cryo carry. Even if you don't. If your freeze team without Escoffier, or if your freeze team with Escoffier is going to be like Yulan, Farina, Xingqiu, or Yulan, Farina, Rosaria, that'll still be pretty similar to the Skirk teams you can make without Escoffier. I have probably said the word Escoffier over 100 times in this video, and the unfortunate reality is that Escoffier is Cryo now. At least when it comes to Cryo carries, their meta teams are entirely defined by Escoffier because Escoffier is just a balance abomination. There's a few characters I haven't talked about too much that I quickly want to mention, mainly Citlali and Shenhe. Citlali's kit doesn't directly do anything for cryo carries, but because she's a Natlan character, she can use Cinder City, and because she's a catalyst, she can use TTDS. And those two things by themselves are enough to make her competitive with other support options in a lot of situations, even if you're not doing a lot of Hydro damage, even if the Hydro Shred isn't helping you. Because of that, Citlali is a fairly viable option in a lot of the cryo carry teams as a last slot. That being said, unfortunately, you can't get quite the full value in quite a few teams because it can often be difficult to both proc Cinder City and give TTDS to your carry. If you have Escoffier, you have a cryo carry, you have Farina, it'll be hard to end up with a Hydro Aura when you use Citlali's skill. You'll probably end up with a cryo or a frozen aura, and that makes it so that Citlali does not trigger frozen, which means you don't get the Cinder City 40 damage %. So generally, you end up either giving TTDS to Escoffier because you have to swap to Citlali before you swap to Escoffier, or putting Citlali on another weapon altogether. And the other character I want to talk about is Shenhe. Shenhe kind of has has the Eula problem where her numbers are just not good. Overall, Shenhe is not a bad character, but she provides buffs comparable to generic buffers as a niche buffer. Most niche buffers, pretty much Goro aside, provide so many buffs to their niche. You look at Chevreuse at C6, 60 damage percent, 40 attack percent, and 40 shred. You look at Farazan, 40 crit damage, 30 shred, 38 damage percent, and a ton of energy that gets generated off field, right, from the C6, so your carry's catching them. If your carry is burst reliant, that's very valuable. Comparatively, in terms of number of things she does, Shenhe has a lot, but all the numbers on them are smaller than on the new units. Her quill buffs, I think, tend to be pretty heavily overestimated. If you end up with about 3,000 attack on Skirk and 4,000 attack on Shenhe, which is probably a little bit optimistic for Shenhe, but whatever. The upgrade to the damage you get from Shenhe, and by the way, I'm not including damage percent, resistance, defense, or crit, because all of those factors affect quill damage the same way they affect Skirk damage, right? This is not the total damage number, but this ratio will stay the same, right? And so the 7 quills you get from Shenhe's hold skill gives you about as much damage as 200 attack would, which is about 20% on a character that has about 1,000 base attack. Maybe a little bit more than that. 25%, sure. Which means that what Shenhe is providing in total is 30 damage percent, half of Chevreuse C6. Around 20% attack, half of Chevreuse Ascension passive, and if you crown your burst, 15 res shred, less than half of Chevreuse's res shred. And in terms of personal damage, she's around the same level as Chevreuse. Like, this is what I mean when I say that Shenhe's a pretty bad character. It's not that the things she does aren't useful. It's that the numbers on the things she does and the things she has are just kind of pathetic compared to what new characters do. That being said, we still don't have a great niche buffer for Cryo, which means that Shenhe is still going to see play in a lot of teams and often be the best option. Here, this is not a favorable assumption for Shenhe. Skirk is very powerful, and the more powerful your carry is, the least impactful quills become. Characters that do less motion value, they'll still have the same damage from quills, so if I change this motion value, instead of 12k, I make it 6k, I would now need around 3,350, 3,400, right? So it would be the equivalent of 400 attack instead of 200. And that's with 7 quills. In Ayaka teams, you can get more than 7. You can get 10 quills. That's 3,500, 3,550-ish, right? Now that's 550 attack. Now we're starting to get into territory where this is a lot. It's still not as good as the more recent niche supports, but it is at least better than the generalist supports. That's why, in Skirk teams, Shenhe is pretty much the same overall DPS as Molani. But in Ayaka teams, Shenhe is noticeably better than Molani. Anyways, the reason why I think it's important to talk about Shenhe in this video is because the lack of a great last slot option for freeze teams means that freeze teams have room to grow in the future, which might change the importance of each character in them. So keep an eye out for that. But anyways, that is going to be it for the video on cryo carries. Part of the reason why I procrastinated on this video is because I knew that it would kind of not be a useful one. If you came into this video thinking I should probably only play my cryo carries with Escoffier, you're probably gonna come out of this video thinking I probably shouldn't use my cryo carries without Escoffier. Kind of pisses me off that that's the case, but it kind of is, unfortunately. Anyways, as usual, I hope you didn't learn a thing or two here. You didn't learn anything from this video. You just clicked on it to listen to me yap, not because you wanted to learn something new. Or maybe you clicked on this video because you were hoping for me to have found something, a way of making your cryo character good without Escoffier, and you're holding your head in your hands in disappointment now. I'm sorry. I'll see you in the next one. Bye, YouTube.